She rests in Long Beach, California, tethered to a concrete pier where she has not moved in nearly 6 decades. The hull, once the fastest thing on the Atlantic Ocean, sits motionless in the Pacific. Rust bleeds through the paint in places the maintenance crews cannot reach. The propellers that once drove her across the sea at 30 knots lie somewhere else entirely, removed and sold for scrap long ago. From the shore, she still looks magnificent. The black hull rises from the water. The white superstructure climbs above that. 3 red funnels, though only 2 ever function, stand against the California sky like monuments to an age when ships were cathedrals and crossing an ocean was an event worth dressing for. Walk aboard, and the grandeur becomes more complicated. The first-class dining room still gleams with its original wood paneling, restored and polished for tourists who pay admission to wander where movie stars and royalty once dined. But other corridors are roped off. Ceilings sag in places. Somewhere below the waterline, sections of the hull have corroded so badly that engineers have welded steel plates over the damage rather than attempt proper repairs. The ship that was once the pride of the British Empire, that carried a queen's name and a nation's hopes, that transported nearly 1 million soldiers during the Second World War, has become something else entirely. A hotel, a museum, a wedding venue, and, according to thousands of visitors and dozens of paranormal investigators, one of the most haunted places in America. This is the story of the RMS Queen Mary. Not just how she was built or how she sailed, but how she arrived at this strange afterlife. A ship designed for movement, frozen in place. A vessel built for luxury, now famous for ghosts. A floating palace that became a floating ruin, saved from the scrapyard only to face a slower kind of decay. The story begins not with steel or rivets, but with pride, national pride, corporate ambition, the desperate need, in the years after the First World War, for Britain to prove it still ruled the waves, and the equally desperate need, in the years of the Great Depression, for a shipyard full of men to have work. If you enjoy stories about ships, history, and the strange fates that befall things humans build, please consider subscribing. These deep dives take considerable research, and your support helps make them possible. Let us begin where the Queen Mary began, in an era of ocean liners racing each other across the Atlantic and nations racing each other for prestige. Chapter 1. The World That Built Her. The 1920s were the golden age of the Atlantic liner. Every major European nation operated ships that crossed between the old world and the new, carrying passengers, mail, and an enormous weight of national symbolism. These were not merely transportation. They were floating embassies, advertisements for the industrial and artistic achievements of the countries that built them. Germany launched the Bremen and the Europa in 1929, sleek vessels that immediately captured the Blue Riband, the unofficial prize for the fastest Atlantic crossing. France was constructing the Normandy, a ship so radically beautiful that observers called it Art Deco made seaworthy. Italy had its Rex and Conte di Savoia. Even the smaller maritime nations competed to demonstrate that they, too, could build something impressive. Britain watched these developments with growing concern. The Cunard Line, the venerable shipping company that had dominated Atlantic travel for generations, was operating vessels that were aging and increasingly outclassed. The Mauretania, built in 1906, had held the Blue Riband for over 2 decades, but by the late 1920s she was showing her years. The Aquitania, launched just before the First World War, remained elegant, but could not match the speed of the new German ships. Cunard's leadership understood that prestige translated directly into bookings. Wealthy passengers wanted to sail on the finest, fastest ships. If Britain could not offer competitive vessels, The passengers and their money would flow to Germany, France, and Italy instead. The company began planning two new superliners in the mid-1920s. These would be larger, faster, and more luxurious than anything afloat. They would restore British supremacy on the Atlantic and demonstrate to the world that the nation that had built the greatest maritime empire in history still possessed the skill and ambition to lead. The first of these ships received the construction number 534. No name was assigned initially. Cunard traditionally named its passenger ships with names ending in IA: Mauritania, Lusitania, Aquitania. The new vessel would presumably follow this pattern, though the final choice remained undecided. The contract went to John Brown and Company, a shipyard on the River Clyde in Scotland. The Clyde had been building ships for centuries. The region understood steel, understood rivets, understood the particular challenges of constructing enormous vessels in a relatively narrow river and then navigating them out to the open sea. John Brown had built battleships for the Royal Navy and liners for Cunard. They had the expertise. Work began in December 1930. The keel was laid, and construction proceeded through the following months. The frame of the ship rose in the building berth, a skeleton of steel ribs that would eventually support over 80,000 tons of completed vessel. Workers swarmed the structure daily, thousands of them, in an area where unemployment had reached devastating levels. Then the money stopped. The Great Depression, which had begun with the American stock market crash of 1929, spread across the Atlantic with punishing force. Trade collapsed, banks failed. Companies that had seemed permanent fixtures of British industry went into receivership. Cunard, facing catastrophic losses as passenger bookings evaporated, could no longer fund construction. On December 11, 1931, work on Hull 534 ceased. The half-built ship stood in the yard, exposed to Scottish weather, while the men who had been constructing her were sent home. Over 3,000 workers lost their jobs at John Brown alone. The ripple effects through suppliers and subcontractors cost thousands more. The idle ship became a symbol. To some, it represented the failure of capitalism, the inability of the economic system to complete even a project already well underway. To others, it represented hope deferred, a promise that prosperity would eventually return and the great ship would be finished. Photographers came to document the rusting hull. Politicians made speeches about it. The ship that had no name became the most famous unfinished object in Britain. For over 2 years, Hull 534 sat motionless. The steel frame oxidized. The tools lay where workers had dropped them. The cranes stood silent. Clydebank, the town that had grown up around the shipyard, struggled to survive. Men who had built ships for their entire working lives had nothing to build. The resolution came through government intervention. In 1934, Parliament approved a loan to allow construction to resume, but attached conditions. Cunard would merge with its rival, the White Star Line, creating a combined company strong enough to survive the Depression and to operate the new superliners profitably. The merger went forward. The loan was dispersed. In April 1934, work on Hull 534 began again. The unemployed men returned. The cranes moved. The riveting hammers resumed their clamor. The ship that had waited in silence for 27 months would finally be completed, but she still needed a name. Chapter 2: Designing an Icon. The naval architects who designed Hull 534 faced a seemingly impossible set of requirements. The ship had to be large enough to carry over 2,000 passengers in comfort, with separate accommodations for first class, cabin class, and tourist class. She had to be fast enough to cross the Atlantic in under 5 days, maintaining speeds above 28 knots in all weather. She had to be stable enough to provide a smooth ride even in the notorious North Atlantic storms. And she had to be beautiful, a vessel that announced British engineering excellence to everyone who saw her. Sir John Brown's chief naval architect was a man named John Brown. The coincidence of names was purely that, a coincidence. The shipyard had been named for its founder, while the architect was simply another John Brown, one of the most respected ship designers in Britain. He led a team that spent years refining the hull form, the propulsion systems, and the internal arrangements. The hull presented particular challenges. Speed required a long, narrow shape that could slice through the water with minimal resistance. But passenger comfort required width, space for grand public rooms, and comfortable cabins. The designers eventually settled on a length of over 1,000 feet and a beam of 118 feet, proportions that balanced the competing needs. The bow was designed with a pronounced rake, angling forward as it rose from the waterline. This shape helped the ship climb over waves rather than plowing through them, reducing pitching in heavy seas. The stern featured a cruiser configuration, a rounded shape that improved efficiency at high speeds. Every curve of the hull was tested in tank models before being finalized. Propulsion came from 4 sets of Parsons single reduction geared turbines, driving 4 propellers. The machinery spaces occupied a substantial portion of the ship's interior, housing the turbines, the boilers, and the auxiliary equipment needed to generate the power for a small city. At full output, the engines could produce over 160,000 shaft horsepower, enough to drive the 81,000-ton vessel at speeds exceeding 30 knots. The superstructure rose in tiers above the hull. The promenade decks allowed passengers to walk in the open air, protected from wind by glass screens. Above those, the boat deck carried the lifeboats required by post-Titanic regulations, though the designers worked to integrate them into the profile rather than simply bolting them on as afterthoughts. The 3 funnels, painted Cunard red with black tops, dominated the skyline. Only 2 of the 3 actually vented exhaust from the boilers. The third was a dummy, added for aesthetic balance and to house ventilation equipment. Inside, the ship was divided by class in the manner typical of the era. First-class passengers occupied the most desirable spaces, amidships on the upper decks where motion was minimized. Their accommodations included suites with private verandas, some spanning the full width of the ship. The first-class dining room could seat over 800 people at once beneath a ceiling that rose 2 decks high. The first-class lounge featured a massive map of the Atlantic, with a crystal model of the ship that moved along a track to show progress during crossings. Cabin class, the middle tier, occupied spaces slightly farther from the center of the ship. The accommodations were smaller but still comfortable, with dedicated public rooms that were merely elegant rather than opulent. Tourist class, at the bottom of the hierarchy, filled the forward and aft sections where vibration and motion were more noticeable. Even these spaces, however, were designed to standards that would have seemed luxurious on ships of a generation earlier. The interior design drew on the work of dozens of artists and craftsmen. Over 50 different types of wood were used in the paneling, from English oak to African mahogany. The first-class smoking room featured a painting of the royal family commissioned specifically for the space. Art Deco motifs appeared throughout, reflecting the design sensibilities of the 1930s, while avoiding anything too aggressively modern. The designers understood that passengers would spend 5 or more days aboard. Every aspect of the experience had to be considered. The ship needed restaurants, bars, lounges, a swimming pool, a gym, a library, a children's playroom, a hospital, a synagogue, a chapel, and hundreds of other facilities that passengers might need or desire. She was not simply a vehicle, she was a destination. By the time the design was finalized, the ship represented the accumulated knowledge of a century of ocean liner development. Every lesson learned from previous vessels, every innovation that had proven successful, every mistake that had cost lives or comfort, was incorporated into the plans. The Queen Mary, as she would soon be named, was intended to be the finest ocean liner ever built. Whether she achieved that goal would depend on the men who actually assembled her. 1. Chapter 3. Building the Dream. The workers who built the Queen Mary came from Clydebank and the surrounding towns, communities where shipbuilding was not merely an industry, but an identity. Fathers taught sons the trades. Families had worked at John Brown for generations. When the yard fell silent during the Depression halt, it felt like the heart of the region had stopped beating. The resumption of work in 1934 was therefore more than an economic event. It was a resurrection. Men who had spent over 2 years scraping by on public assistance or odd jobs returned to the yard with something approaching joy. The local newspaper reported that workers arrived early on the first day back, eager to resume the task they had been forced to abandon. The workforce eventually numbered over 10,000 at peak construction. They included riveters, welders, platers, electricians, pipe fitters, carpenters, painters, and dozens of other trades. Each group had its own traditions, its own hierarchies, its own pride. The riveters, who fastened steel plates to the frame with millions of red-hot metal pins, considered themselves the aristocracy of the yard. Their work required teams of 4, one heating the rivet in a portable forge, one catching it in tongs, one holding it in place with a device called a dolly, and one driving it home with a pneumatic hammer. A good team could set hundreds of rivets in a shift. The conditions were brutal by modern standards. The ship's interior, during construction, was a maze of scaffolding, temporary lighting, and partially completed spaces. Workers climbed through openings that would later become doorways. They crawled into compartments that would eventually hold passengers, but now held only the skeletons of what was to come. The noise was constant and deafening. The air carried dust, metal shavings, and the fumes from welding torches. Safety regulations existed, but were less rigorous than those that would develop in later decades. Falls were common. Burns from hot metal sent men to the yard's medical station daily. The exact number of workers injured during construction is difficult to determine, but some estimates suggest that hundreds suffered significant accidents. At least one death occurred when a worker fell from a height. The workers were aware that they were building something extraordinary. The ship's size exceeded anything previously constructed in Britain. Walking the length of the hull during construction meant covering more than 1,000 feet of steel. Standing at one end and looking toward the other, the structure seemed to stretch toward infinity. Men who had spent their careers building ships still found the scale astonishing. The launch was set for September the 26th, 1934. By that date, the hull was complete and ready to enter the water, though enormous amounts of work remained to fit out the interior. Cunard arranged for Queen Mary, the wife of King George V, to perform the christening ceremony. The choice of sponsor suggested what the ship's name would be, though Cunard maintained the suspense until the moment of launch. The story of how the name was chosen has become legend, though its accuracy is disputed. According to the most popular version, Cunard's chairman approached King George V to request permission to name the ship after the greatest queen this country has ever known. The chairman meant Queen Victoria, continuing Cunard's tradition of names ending in IA. The king, however, assumed the reference was to his wife. "That is the greatest compliment ever paid to my wife," he reportedly said. "I'll ask her." Whether the story is true or embellished, the result was the same. The ship would be called Queen Mary, breaking the naming tradition, but gaining something arguably more valuable, a royal connection and a royal sponsor. The launch itself was a spectacle. Over 200,000 people crowded the riverbanks and surrounding hills to watch. Stands had been erected for dignitaries and ticket holders. Newsreel cameras recorded the event for cinema audiences around the world. Queen Mary spoke into a microphone connected to amplifiers that carried her voice across the assembled crowd. "I am happy to name this ship Queen Mary," she said. "I wish success to her and to all who sail in her." She pressed a button. A bottle of Australian wine swung against the bow and shattered. The drag chains that held the hull in place were released, slowly at first. Then, with gathering momentum, the enormous vessel slid down the ways and into the River Clyde. The displacement of such a massive object into the relatively narrow river created a wave that surged toward the opposite bank. Workers and spectators had been warned to move back, but the wave still splashed over the retaining walls in places. The ship herself, suddenly afloat, was caught by tugs that had been standing by and guided to a fitting-out berth where the work of completing her interior would begin. The hull was in the water. Everything else remained to be done. Chapter 4. Maiden Voyages and the Golden Age. The fitting-out process took another 18 months. The shell of a ship that had launched in September 1934 had to be transformed into a floating hotel capable of hosting the wealthy and powerful in the style they expected. Every cabin had to be finished. Every piece of furniture had to be manufactured and installed. The engines and boilers had to be connected, tested, and certified. The thousands of systems that made up a modern liner, from electrical wiring to plumbing to ventilation, had to be completed and integrated. By May 1936, the Queen Mary was ready for sea trials. She sailed from the Clyde to the open Atlantic, where her officers and crew tested her at various speeds and in various conditions. The results exceeded expectations. The ship handled well, responded to the helm predictably, and achieved speeds that suggested she could claim the Blue Riband from the French Normandy. On May 27, 1936, the Queen Mary departed Southampton on her maiden voyage to New York. The passenger list read like a who's who of British and American society: industrialists, politicians, film stars, members of parliament, American heiresses returning home after European travels. Over 1,800 passengers in total, paying fares that ranged from modest, for tourist class, to extraordinary, for the most luxurious suites. The crossing took 5 days. The ship did not attempt a speed record on this first voyage, instead giving the crew time to shake down the vessel and identify any issues that needed correction. Passengers found the accommodations magnificent. The first-class dining room impressed even those accustomed to the finest hotels on land. The lounges and public rooms provided space for socializing, for entertainment, for simply watching the sea slide past. The first-class experience differed dramatically from tourist class, though passengers in the lower tier were generally satisfied with what they received. The separation of classes was rigidly enforced. Barriers and locked doors prevented tourist-class passengers from wandering into first-class spaces. The 3 groups of passengers might as well have been on different ships for all the interaction they had. The ship's crew numbered over 100. Stewards attended to passenger needs. Cooks prepared thousands of meals daily. Engineers monitored the machinery. Officers navigated and maintained order. A small army of workers, largely invisible to the passengers, kept the floating city functioning. Their quarters, deep in the hull and far from the elegant public spaces, were cramped and utilitarian. The contrast with first-class accommodations could hardly have been sharper. New York greeted the Queen Mary with enthusiasm. Tugboats sprayed water in ceremonial arcs as she approached the harbor. Crowds gathered at the pier. Newspapers documented every detail of her arrival. The ship that Britain had built to reclaim Atlantic supremacy had successfully completed her first crossing. The Blue Riband came later that same year. In August 1936, the Queen Mary crossed from Ambrose Light, outside New York Harbor, to Bishop Rock at the entrance to the English Channel, in 3 days, 23 hours, and 57 minutes at an average speed of 30.14 knots. She had beaten the Normandy's record. Britain held the prize once again. The rivalry between the two ships became a spectacle in itself. The Normandy recaptured the record in 1937, only for the Queen Mary to take it back later that year with a crossing averaging 30.99 knots. The competition drove both vessels to their limits and captured public imagination on both sides of the Atlantic. Newspapers reported each crossing with the intensity usually reserved for sporting events. Beyond the speed records, the Queen Mary developed a reputation as a remarkably stable ship. Her hull form and stabilization systems reduced rolling even in heavy weather. Passengers who had dreaded seasickness on previous crossings found they could walk the decks comfortably even when the sea was rough. This reputation attracted travelers who might otherwise have chosen slower but steadier vessels. The late 1930s represented the Queen Mary's golden age. She crossed the Atlantic regularly, carrying thousands of passengers each way. Her passenger lists included Winston Churchill, then out of government but still prominent, Fred Astaire, Marlene Dietrich, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor after the abdication crisis, and countless other figures whose names made headlines. The ship became a venue for important conversations, for romances, for business deals, for all the activities that occur when influential people are confined together in elegant surroundings for nearly a week. The service aboard was meticulous. First-class passengers could expect attention that rivaled the finest hotels. Stewards learned preferences and anticipated needs. The food was prepared by chefs who had trained in Europe's best kitchens. The wine cellars stocked vintages that were difficult to obtain even on land. Everything was designed to make the crossing not merely tolerable, but delightful. For the crew, the reality was different. The work was demanding, the hours long, the pay modest. Stewards served at the pleasure of passengers who sometimes treated them as barely human. Engine room workers labored in heat that could reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The glamour that passengers experienced existed because workers, largely invisible, made it possible. This arrangement, luxury for the few sustained by labor from the many, was not unique to the Queen Mary. It characterized ocean liner travel throughout the era. The ship simply embodied the system at its most extreme, the most luxurious spaces afloat, served by one of the largest crews ever assembled on a merchant vessel. By 1939, the Queen Mary had established herself as the flagship of the Atlantic. The Queen Elizabeth, her sister ship and slightly larger, was under construction at John Brown. Cunard anticipated that the two vessels would dominate Atlantic travel for decades to come, alternating crossings and providing passengers with the choice of two equally magnificent ships. Then, Germany invaded Poland. Chapter 5. Cracks in the Hull. The signs of trouble had been accumulating for years. Adolf Hitler's rise to power in 1933 had set Germany on a collision course with its neighbors. The remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, the annexation of Austria in 1938, the occupation of Czechoslovakia in 1939, each step brought war closer. The passengers who drank champagne in the Queen Mary's first-class lounge during the late 1930s were often discussing not whether, but when the fighting would begin. For the Queen Mary herself, there were more immediate concerns. The ship was operating at a loss. Despite the prestige and the press coverage, the economics of running a superliner were punishing. The fuel costs alone were enormous. The crew numbered over 1,000. Maintenance on a vessel of such complexity required constant attention. First-class passengers paid well, but there were never enough of them to cover costs. Tourist class made up the difference in volume, but even with full bookings, the margins were thin. Cunard had expected that the Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth, operating together, would achieve economies of scale that a single ship could not. But the Queen Elizabeth was not yet complete. The Queen Mary operated alone, competing against the Normandy and other vessels for a passenger base that was, by the late 1930s, shrinking. Wealthy Americans who might have crossed the Atlantic for pleasure were increasingly nervous about traveling to a continent sliding toward war. The ship also showed the wear of intensive service. 3 years of regular crossings had stressed systems that were designed for durability, but not for eternity. Minor mechanical issues became more frequent. The hull, subjected to the constant pounding of waves and the vibration of engines, developed small cracks that required monitoring. None of these problems were critical, but they accumulated. Then came the crossing of September 1939. The Queen Mary was in New York when Britain declared war on Germany on September 3rd. The ship, suddenly transformed from a luxury liner into a potential target, could not safely return to Britain through waters where German submarines were already hunting. She remained in New York, tied up at her pier, waiting for orders. The wait lasted 6 months. The Queen Mary sat idle through the fall and winter of 1939-1940, her crew reduced to a maintenance skeleton, her passenger spaces empty. The ship that had been the pride of the British merchant marine was reduced to an object of anxiety. Would she be seized by the American government, which was officially neutral? Would a German saboteur attempt to damage her? Would she ever sail again? In March 1940, Cunard received orders to send the Queen Mary to Sydney, Australia, where she would be converted for war service. The crossing of the Pacific was made in secrecy, with the ship painted gray to reduce visibility and running without lights at night. The liner that had dazzled passengers with her elegance arrived in Australia looking like a ghost of herself. The conversion stripped away everything that had made the Queen Mary a luxury vessel. The elegant furniture was removed and stored. The fine wood paneling was covered with hardboard to protect it. The first-class dining room, which had served caviar and champagne to society figures, was fitted with mess tables to feed thousands of soldiers. Sleeping quarters were installed in every available space, bunks stacked 3 and 4 high in rooms that had once held a single bed. When the conversion was complete, the Queen Mary could carry over 15,000 troops on a single crossing. No other vessel afloat could match that capacity. The ship that had been built to pamper 2,000 passengers in varying degrees of luxury was now a military transport designed to move an army. She was painted entirely gray, camouflaged against the sea and sky. The crew called her the Gray Ghost. Chapter 6. The Gray Ghost. The Queen. Mary's war service began in the waters around Australia, ferrying troops to and from various theaters of the Pacific and Indian Ocean conflicts. But her most important work came after America entered the war in December 1941. The need to transport American soldiers to Britain for the eventual invasion of Europe created a logistics challenge of unprecedented scale. The Queen Mary, with her extraordinary speed and capacity, was uniquely suited to meet it. Speed was the Queen Mary's greatest protection. German U-boats, the submarines that had devastated Allied shipping, could not keep pace with a vessel capable of sustained speeds above 28 knots. The submarines typically surfaced to fire their torpedoes, then submerged to escape retaliation. But against a target moving at nearly 30 knots and zigzagging unpredictably, even surface submarines struggled to achieve firing solutions. The Queen Mary crossed the Atlantic without escort, relying entirely on her speed to evade attack. The crossings were brutal for the soldiers aboard. The ship, designed for 2,000 passengers, now carried 15,000 or more. Every corridor was packed. Every cabin housed far more men than its original design intended. The swimming pool was drained and filled with bunks. The Grand Lounge became a dormitory. Men slept in shifts because there were not enough bunks for everyone to sleep simultaneously. The food was adequate but monotonous. The facilities were overwhelmed. The sanitation systems, designed for a fraction of the passengers now aboard, struggled to cope. Soldiers waited in lines for everything, for meals, for toilets, for a few square feet of deck space where they could breathe fresh air. The crossing typically took 5 days, and for many soldiers, it was the most uncomfortable 5 days of their lives. The crew worked under equal strain. The reduced, wartime complement meant longer hours and heavier duties. The constant vigilance against submarine attack meant little sleep and constant tension. The knowledge that a single torpedo could kill thousands of men weighed on everyone aboard. The worst moment came on October 2nd, 1942. The Queen Mary was approaching the coast of Scotland, having completed another troop-carrying crossing from New York. Standard procedure called for light cruisers to rendezvous with the liner and escort her through the final leg of the journey, where the concentration of German submarines was highest. On this occasion, the escort included HMS Curacoa, an older anti-aircraft cruiser. The Curacoa took up position ahead and slightly to the side of the Queen Mary. Both vessels were zigzagging, following patterns designed to confuse submarine commanders attempting to calculate torpedo solutions. The problem was that the Queen Mary's zigzag pattern and the Curacoa's pattern were not coordinated. The two vessels were moving independently, each following orders that did not account for the other. At approximately 2:12 in the afternoon, the paths converged. The Queen Mary, vastly larger and moving at high speed, struck the Curacoa nearly amidships. The collision cut the cruiser in half. The impact was felt throughout the Queen Mary. Soldiers and crew rushed to the railings and saw the Curacoa's bow and stern separating, each section floating briefly before sinking. Men were in the water, hundreds of them, struggling in the cold North Atlantic. The Queen Mary did not stop. Standing orders were explicit. Under no circumstances was the liner to halt for any reason while in submarine-infested waters. Stopping to rescue survivors would have made the Queen Mary herself a stationary target, risking the 10,000 American soldiers aboard. The captain made the decision that his orders required. The ship continued toward port. Behind her, the Curacoa's survivors struggled in the water. The destroyers that formed the outer ring of the escort eventually returned to rescue those they could reach. Of the Curacoa's crew of 439, only 101 survived. The remaining 338 died, either in the collision, in the water waiting for rescue, or from injuries sustained in the impact. The disaster was covered by wartime secrecy. No public announcement was made. The families of the dead Curacoa crew were informed through official channels, but the circumstances were not disclosed. The soldiers aboard the Queen Mary, witnesses to the collision, were ordered not to discuss what they had seen. The full story did not become public until after the war ended. The collision and its aftermath haunted the Queen Mary. The damage to her bow was repaired in a Boston shipyard. She returned to service within weeks, continuing to shuttle troops across the Atlantic as if nothing had happened. But the crew knew. The soldiers who had witnessed the collision knew. And in the decades that followed, the Curacoa disaster became part of the Queen Mary's dark legend, one of the sources, according to some, of the hauntings that visitors would later report. The Queen Mary continued trooping for the remainder of the war. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, she had carried over 800,000 military personnel across various oceans. Winston Churchill crossed on her several times to meet with Roosevelt. The highest-ranking Allied commanders sailed on her to and from conferences. Adolf Hitler reportedly offered a $250,000 bounty and the Iron Cross to any U-boat captain who could sink her. None succeeded. The war transformed the Queen Mary from a symbol of luxury into a symbol of service. But service had a cost. The ship that emerged from the war was battered, worn, and fundamentally changed. Returning her to passenger service would require not merely removing the wartime fittings, but rebuilding much of what made her magnificent. Chapter 7. Aftermath and the Long Decline. The Queen Mary returned to civilian service in July 1947, after nearly 2 years of refurbishment in Southampton. The work cost over £1 million, a figure that reflected the scale of restoration required. The fine wood paneling was uncovered and restored. The furniture that had been stored in warehouses was brought back. New carpets were laid. The mechanical systems, strained by years of intensive wartime use, were overhauled or replaced. She was recognizably the same ship that had dominated Atlantic travel before the war. But the world she returned to was fundamentally different. The passenger base that had sustained the Queen Mary in the 1930s, wealthy travelers willing to spend 5 days crossing the ocean in style, had not disappeared, but it was no longer expanding. Air travel, which had been a novelty before the war, was becoming a practical alternative for those who valued speed over experience. The early transatlantic flights were expensive and uncomfortable, but they reduced a crossing that took days to a journey that took hours. For the first decade after the war, the Queen Mary remained profitable. The pent-up demand for travel created a boom that filled the ship's cabins. Immigrants traveling to new lives in America, or returning refugees filled tourist class. Businessmen and celebrities still preferred the liner's elegance to the cramped cabins of early aircraft. The Queen Elizabeth joined her sister on the Atlantic run, and for a time, the two ships provided the service that Cunard had envisioned since the 1930s. But the jet age was coming. The de Havilland Comet entered service in 1952. Boeing 707 followed in 1958. These aircraft offered transatlantic crossings in 8 hours, a fraction of the time required by even the fastest ocean liner. The fares were competitive with first-class ship passage. For travelers who valued their time, there was no longer any reason to spend 5 days at sea. The Queen Mary's passenger numbers began declining in the early 1960s. Decline was gradual at first, then accelerating. By 1965, the ship was operating at a loss. Cunard attempted various strategies to attract passengers: cruises to the Caribbean, special theme crossings, reduced fares during off-peak seasons. Nothing stemmed the tide. The ship also showed her age. Maintaining a vessel built in the 1930s to the standards passengers expected in the 1960s required constant investment. Systems that had been modern 30 years earlier were now obsolete. The fuel consumption remained enormous, while newer ships, designed with more efficient engines, could operate at lower cost. The Queen Mary was becoming not merely unprofitable, but economically untenable. Cunard's board faced a decision. They could pour additional millions into keeping the Queen Mary operational, knowing that the return to profitability was unlikely. They could convert her to a different role, perhaps a cruise ship designed for tropical waters rather than Atlantic crossings. Or they could retire her. The decision was made in 1967. The Queen Mary would complete her final transatlantic crossing and then be sold to whatever buyer offered acceptable terms. The ship that had carried nearly 1 million soldiers during the war, that had served as a floating symbol of British maritime achievement for 3 decades, would leave Cunard service. The final crossing departed Southampton on September 16, 1967. The passengers included many who had sailed on her before, who wanted to experience the ship one final time before she passed into history. The mood aboard was elegiac. Toasts were raised in the first-class dining room. The orchestra played songs that had been popular in her golden age. Passengers walked the decks knowing they would not walk them again. The Queen Mary arrived in New York on September 22nd. After a brief layover, she departed on October the 31st for Long Beach, California. The city had purchased her for $345 million, With plans to convert her into a hotel, museum, and tourist attraction, she would never cross an ocean again. The journey to Long Beach required sailing around Cape Horn, the southern tip of South America. The ship was too large for the Panama Canal. The voyage took 39 days, covering over 14,000 miles. When she arrived in Long Beach on December 9, 1967, a crowd of thousands greeted her. She was berthed at a specially prepared pier where she would remain, permanently moored for the rest of her existence. The maritime career of the RMS Queen Mary had ended. A strange new chapter was about to begin. Chapter 8. A floating hotel in search of a purpose. The city of Long Beach had ambitious plans. The Queen Mary would anchor an entertainment complex that would draw tourists from around the world. The ship herself would be converted into a luxury hotel, with her first-class cabins restored and upgraded for modern guests. A maritime museum would occupy additional spaces. Restaurants, shops, and attractions would fill the remaining areas. The combination of history and spectacle would make Long Beach a destination. The conversion proved far more difficult and expensive than anticipated. The ship had been designed for ocean crossings, not permanent mooring. Systems that worked while underway, from plumbing to ventilation, required complete redesign for static operation. The hull, which had been maintained for speed and seaworthiness, now needed to be stabilized for an indefinite stay in one location. The salt water that surrounded her began corroding steel that had never been intended for permanent immersion. Contractors discovered problems that inspections had missed. The original diesel generators were removed to create additional interior space, but their replacements proved inadequate. The electrical systems, designed for a vessel with its own power plant, had to be connected to shore power in ways the original engineers never intended. The ventilation systems, which had relied on the ship's movement through open ocean, had to be replaced with air conditioning suitable for Southern California. The costs mounted. The original estimate of $8 million for conversion grew to $50 million less than higher. The hotel opened in 1971, but the attractions around it struggled. Attendance fell short of projections. The operators who had leased the ship from the city found themselves unable to make payments. The Queen Mary changed hands repeatedly over the following decades. Various operators attempted various strategies. A spruce goose exhibit, displaying Howard Hughes's massive wooden aircraft, drew visitors in the 1980s, but eventually closed. Restaurants opened and closed. Wedding venues came and went. The ship remained, massive and increasingly difficult to maintain, while the organizations responsible for her struggled to find a sustainable business model. The physical deterioration was constant. Saltwater corrodes steel. In a ship designed to be regularly dry docked for maintenance, this corrosion would have been addressed during periodic inspections and repairs. But the Queen Mary could not be dry docked. She was too large for any facility in Southern California, and the cost of towing her to a suitable location was prohibitive. Maintenance crews addressed what they could reach, but large portions of the hull below the waterline were neglected. Engineering reports, some of which became public, painted an increasingly alarming picture. Sections of the hull had corroded to the point where they were no longer structurally sound. Temporary repairs, including welded plates covering damaged areas, extended the ship's lifespan, but did not address the underlying problem. Estimates of what full restoration would cost reached into the hundreds of millions of dollars. The hotel continued operating through these difficulties. Guests slept in converted staterooms that still retained some period character. They dined in restaurants that occupied spaces where passengers had dined decades earlier. They walked the decks, visited the museum exhibits, and took tours that recounted the ship's history. And increasingly, they came looking for ghosts. Chapter 9, The Hauntings. The stories began almost as soon as the Queen Mary opened to the public. Staff members reported strange sounds in empty corridors. Guests described seeing figures that disappeared when approached. Lights flickered in spaces where the electrical systems had been thoroughly renovated. Doors that had been locked were found open. Objects moved from where they had been placed. The first stories centered on areas with documented histories of death. The engine room, where at least one crewman had been crushed by a watertight door during a drill decades earlier, was said to harbor an unsettled presence. The pool areas, where two women had drowned in separate incidents during the ship's operational life, reportedly echoed with the sound of splashing water even when empty. The forward areas of the hull, near where the ship had struck the Curacoa, were described as unnaturally cold. Whether any of these reports reflected genuine paranormal activity or simply the power of suggestion in an environment rich with history and atmosphere, visitors found them compelling. The Queen Mary developed a reputation as one of the most haunted locations in America. Paranormal investigation teams requested access. Television programs featured the ship in episodes devoted to ghost hunting. Books cataloged the reported phenomena. The ship's operators embraced the reputation. Haunted tours became a significant draw. Halloween events transformed the vessel into an elaborate haunted attraction, charging admission to guests who wanted to be frightened in spaces where, the marketing suggested, real spirits might roam. The Queen Mary's financial struggles made any reliable revenue stream valuable, and ghost tourism provided one. The specific stories multiplied. A young girl named Jackie, said to have drowned in the second-class pool, reportedly appeared to visitors and spoke to them. A figure in 1930s dress was seen in first class and then vanished. Knocking sounds in the former engine room were attributed to the spirit of a crew member killed in the machinery. Each story, repeated and embellished, became part of the ship's legend. Skeptics noted that large ships produce many strange sounds as metal expands and contracts with temperature changes, as structural elements shift under stress, as ventilation systems move air through ducts designed for different purposes. The human tendency to find patterns in random noise, combined with the expectation of paranormal activity, could easily produce reports of ghostly phenomena that had mundane explanations. Believers countered that the sheer volume of reports from staff members, guests, and professional investigators over decades suggested something more than suggestion or misperception. They pointed to specific incidents that seemed to have no conventional explanation. They argued that a ship with such a traumatic history, where so many people had lived, worked, and in some cases died, might retain some residue of those experiences. The debate could not be resolved. It did not need to be. The Queen Mary as haunted ship became as significant to her identity as the Queen Mary as luxury liner or troopship had been. The ghosts, whether real or imagined, gave the aging vessel a relevance she might otherwise have lost. But ghosts could not fix the rust. Chapter 10. The Queen. Today, the Queen Mary entered the 2020s in a state of suspended crisis. The ship that had been the pride of an empire was now a deteriorating hulk whose survival depended on decisions yet to be made. Engineering surveys documented the extent of decay with clinical precision. Portions of the hull had corroded to dangerous thinness. The superstructure showed water damage in areas closed to the public. Systems that had been jury-rigged for conversion decades earlier were failing. The COVID-19 pandemic closed the ship to visitors for extended periods, eliminating the revenue that funded basic maintenance. The operating company declared bankruptcy. The city of Long Beach, which still owned the vessel, found itself responsible for a structure that might cost more to repair than any plausible return could justify. Various proposals circulated: a complete restoration, funded by public money or private investment, could return the Queen Mary to something approaching her former glory. Estimates for this work ranged from $250 million to over $500 million, depending on the scope and standards. Alternatively, the ship could be stabilized enough to remain safe for limited visitation, accepting that she would never be fully restored, but preserving her as a historical artifact. The most drastic option, demolition or scuttling, remained technically possible, but was politically and emotionally unthinkable. The Queen Mary had become something no one in 1936 could have anticipated. Not a working ship, but a monument. Not a vehicle, but a venue. She represented an era of travel that no longer existed, a style of craftsmanship that had become economically impossible, and a sense of national pride that had shifted to other objects. Visitors who walked her decks in her final years encountered a vessel caught between identities. Some spaces were immaculately maintained, presented as they might have appeared in the 1930s. Others were closed behind temporary barriers, too damaged or dangerous for public access. The first-class dining room still gleamed, but the views from its windows now showed parking lots and industrial waterfront rather than open ocean. The ghosts, if they existed, had a ship to themselves in the quiet hours. The spirits of those who had built her, sailed on her, worked in her engine rooms, dined in her restaurants, crossed the Atlantic in her cabins, and died on or around her. The memories accumulated across nearly a century and were embedded in her steel like the salt that was slowly dissolving it. What the Queen Mary represented changed with each observer. For some, she was proof of what human ambition and craftsmanship could achieve, a vessel whose beauty and engineering excellence remained impressive even in decline. For others, she was a warning about the costs of grandeur, a structure that consumed resources far beyond what any practical calculation could justify. For still others, she was simply a curiosity, a leftover from an era that had passed, interesting to visit once but not central to contemporary life. The ocean liners that had defined transatlantic travel were nearly gone. The Queen Mary was one of the last survivors, and her survival was precarious. Whether she would be saved or lost, restored or demolished, remembered or forgotten, depended on decisions that had not yet been made by people who might not yet fully understand what they held. She rested in Long Beach, going nowhere, waiting for a future that remained uncertain. Conclusion: what the Queen meant to visit the Queen Mary is to encounter time layered upon time. The Art Deco flourishes that seemed modern in 1936, the emergency modifications that transformed her into a troopship in 1940, the conversions that made her a hotel in 1967, the decay that has accumulated in the decades since. Each layer tells part of her story. Together, they tell a story about what humans build, why they build it, and what happens when the purposes that justified the building no longer apply. The Queen Mary was born from pride. National pride, corporate pride, the pride of workers who understood they were creating something extraordinary. She was designed to prove that Britain still led the world in shipbuilding, that Cunard could compete with any rival, that human skill could master the ocean. For a few years before the war, she succeeded. She was the fastest, the most elegant, the most celebrated vessel on the Atlantic. The war made her something different. The gray ghost who carried armies was not the glittering liner who had carried celebrities. The speed that had impressed passengers became the speed that saved lives. The capacity that had allowed for luxury became the capacity that delivered troops to the beaches of Europe. She proved herself in ways her designers never intended. The post-war decades taught harder lessons. Technology changes, markets shift. What was economically viable in one era becomes ruinous in another. The jet aircraft that rendered the Queen Mary obsolete did not care about her history, her beauty, or the memories she carried. They simply offered a better solution to the problem of crossing an ocean. Progress is indifferent to nostalgia. Her afterlife in Long Beach extended her existence but transformed her meaning. The ship became a container for other purposes: hotel, museum, wedding venue, haunted attraction. Each use kept her alive while pulling her further from what she had originally been. The Queen Mary that greets visitors today is not the Queen Mary that left Southampton in 1936. She is a palimpsest, a text written over repeatedly until the original is nearly obscured. The ghosts may or may not be real. What is certainly real is the human need to find meaning in places where significant events occurred. The engine rooms where men worked and sometimes died. The decks where soldiers stood, watching the horizon for submarines. The cabins where famous passengers slept, unaware that they were becoming part of a story still being told decades later. These spaces carry weight that transcends their physical properties. They matter because we decide they matter. Whether the Queen Mary survives another century, another decade, or another year depends on choices that have not yet been made. Resources that might be devoted to her restoration could be spent on other priorities. Attention that might preserve her could be directed elsewhere. Nothing guarantees that she will endure. Everything that endures does so because someone chose to maintain it. She rests in Long Beach, in the Pacific rather than the Atlantic, on water she was never designed to occupy. The funnels that once trailed smoke across the horizon now stand silent. The engines that drove her at record speeds have been removed. The hull that was built to be the finest on the ocean slowly corrodes, waiting to see if repair or neglect will determine her fate. The Queen Mary is no longer what she was. She is what we have made of her, and what we will make of her, and what we will remember or forget about the world that built her and the purposes she served. She is a ship and a symbol and a ghost story and a lesson. What the lesson teaches depends on who is listening.